The manufactorum never slept. Even at 3 hours past second shift, Press 7 hammered with relentless rhythm, and Max Vaughn couldn't scrub the blood from his memory. Worker 447B, Petran Ullix, had been caught between the plates when the hydraulic seal failed. The press had continued its cycle with mechanical indifference, crushing bone and rupturing organs, while Petran's wife watched from the observation gallery. She'd been bringing him his forgotten lunch pail. Max had filed the maintenance request 6 weeks ago. Insufficient priority rating, the administratum response had read. The Munitorum needed ammunition casings for the war on Gallows. Everything else was secondary, including human lives. "You're thinking again," said a voice behind him. Anna, his wife, stood in the doorway with a thermos of Recaf. She worked the night shift at Medicaid Station 17, 2 districts over. She shouldn't be here. "You'll be late for your shift," Max said, accepting the Recaf anyway. "Already am." Anna's voice was flat in the way it got when she was holding fury behind her teeth. "They brought in wounded from the Tithe riots. 73 civilians, arbites, shock mauls, and riot shotguns. We had 12 beds in triage. The senior chirurgeon ordered us to refuse treatment. The administratum guidelines." "I know the guidelines," Anna's composure cracked. "Civilian casualties rated below military personnel. I watched people bleed out because we needed to keep beds open in case guardsmen got hurt breaking up the next protest." They stood in silence, the press hammers counting the seconds. Around them, thousands of workers moved like components in a vast machine, each person reducible to a labor output rating and caloric requirement. The Imperium of man in microcosm, efficient, brutal, inexorable. "There has to be another way," Anna whispered. Max had been having similar thoughts for months now, but thinking and speaking were different things. In the Imperium, the wrong words could earn you a visit from the Arbites, or worse, the Inquisition. Still, he found himself saying, "There might be." Anna looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "There are rumors, on the loading docks among the cargo haulers, about a rogue trader who operates on the edge of Imperial space. She takes passengers, people looking to disappear. Desertion is punishable by death, only if they catch you." Anna studied his face for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Find out more. But be careful, even rumors can get you killed." Over the following months, Max became very careful indeed. The conspiracy grew slowly, like mold in the underhive. Each contact led to another contact, each whispered conversation to another meeting in the dark corners of the city's industrial districts. There were others who had reached the same conclusion, that the Imperium's promises of protection and prosperity were hollow, that they were being ground down to sustain a war machine that would never stop, never rest, never care if they lived or died. John Krell, a sergeant on garrison duty, whose guard regiment had been ordered to fire on civilian protesters. 43 dead, including the sergeant's younger brother. Silas Cantor, a former hive ganger who'd watched the Arbites burn out his entire block to contain a minor spire gang war. 3,000 casualties, acceptable collateral damage. Dovan and Myra Harrick, whose 3 children had all been selected for Imperial Navy press gangs in the same year. The administratum statistics said it was random. The odds said otherwise. And dozens more, hundreds eventually, all united by the understanding that the Imperium wasn't protecting them, it was consuming them. The planning took over 8 months. They couldn't simply disappear. That would trigger immediate investigations. They needed to be thorough, methodical, patient. Census records were altered through carefully placed bribes and forged documents. Death certificates were created. Fires were arranged in strategic archive buildings. They drowned the administratum in false data, creating a bureaucratic fog that would take years to clear. Anna had her own network. While Max worked the industrial sectors, she moved through the Medicaid facilities, quietly recruiting doctors, chirurgeons, and orderlies who had watched the Imperium's brutality up close. Medical personnel were essential. They'd need skilled hands on Khar'vesh, and these were people already hardened to difficult decisions. She was the one who solved their biggest problem: how to fake plague deaths convincingly enough to explain mass disappearances. Blood samples, she explained to the planning council in a shuttered warehouse basement. We can culture genuine pathogens in controlled environments, then discover outbreaks in the census records we're manipulating. The administratum will quarantine entire sectors rather than investigate closely. Plague is the one thing that makes bureaucrats cautious. It was brilliant. It was also terrifying that she'd thought of it. And all the while, they accumulated resources, equipment bought on the black market, supplies stolen from Munitorum warehouses, thrones pooled from the sale of everything they owned, everything they would need to establish a colony far beyond imperial oversight. Brother Erasmus had been the hardest to approach and the most dangerous, but Max had seen something in the man's eyes during sermons, almost like he had lost his purpose when he recited the standard litanies about the Emperor's protection, and they would need all the protection they could get once they left. When Max finally approached him in the empty chapel after midnight mass, the priest's first reaction had been to reach for his Aquila pendant, hand trembling. "What you speak of is heresy. Damnation. We're already damned," Max said quietly. The priest had been silent for a long moment, his weathered face illuminated by dying votive candles. Then, "I have presided over 347 funerals in 5 years. Workers crushed in presses, children dead from preventable illness, families torn apart by press gangs. Each time I told them it was the Emperor's will, that their sacrifice mattered." His voice cracked. "I have lied 347 times. Come with us. If I do this," Erasmus's hand fell from his Aquila, "I am forsaking my vows, betraying everything I swore to uphold, or keeping the only vow that matters, to protect his children." The priest's participation remained conditional. He refused to encourage others to join, though he wouldn't stop them either. And he insisted that whatever they built on Khar'vesh, there would be room for faith. He would come, but he would carry his doubts and his guilt like chains. Max accepted those terms. A conflicted priest was better than no priest at all, and honesty, even painful honesty, was more valuable than false certainty. Finally, Max found himself in a private cabin aboard the Guilt Venture, facing Captain Severina Cantor. The rogue trader was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 40 standard years, with one augmetic eye and one organic that gleamed with predatory intelligence. Her office smelled of incense and machine oil, and the walls were lined with curiosities, Xeno's artifacts that would have earned her an inquisitorial investigation anywhere in Imperial space proper. "You understand what you're asking," Severina said, her augmetic eye cycling through different visual spectrums. "My warrant of trade gives me latitude to pursue commercial opportunities beyond the Imperium's immediate reach. But this is within that latitude," Max finished. He'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times. "You're transporting colonists to establish a mining operation on an unclaimed world in the Eastern Fringe. All technically legal." "Technically," Severina's flesh eye gleamed with amusement, "the administratum will still investigate. They always do when a tithe shipment comes up short. We've arranged for accidents, fires in census records, falsified death certificates, multiple conflicting reports of plague outbreaks, industrial disasters, and shipping accidents. It'll take them years to untangle, if they even bother. We're not important enough to warrant that level of investigation. And when they do bother," Max met her gaze steadily, "we'll be beyond their reach. And you'll be protected by the terms of your warrant. You transporting colonists in good faith, paid the appropriate tariffs, filed the proper documentation. You're a legitimate merchant operating under Imperial license." Severina laughed, a harsh bark. "You've thought this through. Good. Too many idealists think passion is enough. The Imperium is built on paperwork, and you've learned to drown them in it." She leaned forward. "But my price isn't just thrones. When you're established, I want first rights to anything you find. Archaeotech, Xeno's artifacts, unusual minerals. The Eastern Fringe is full of dead civilizations, and I have buyers who pay well for curiosities." "Done," Max said without hesitation. They'd expected this. "Then we have an accord." Severina reached across the desk, her augmetic hand gleaming in the low light. Max shook it, feeling the cold metal against his palm. "But understand this. I can't protect you forever. Once you're on Khar'vesh, you're on your own. The Imperium's reach is long, and they don't forgive desertion, ever. We know, do you? Severina's expression turned serious. Do you really understand what you're giving up? The Imperium is cruel, yes, brutal and uncaring. But it's also all that stands between humanity and extinction. Out there are things that would make the Arbites seem gentle by comparison. The galaxy is not kind to those who stand alone. We'll take our chances. Severina studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Boarding begins in 3 days. Tell your people to bring only what they can carry. Everything else we provide for a price. She paused. One more thing. The Eastern Fringe is contested space. The Tau Empire expands toward these sectors, and there are reports of a new Xenos threat, something the Inquisition calls tyrannids. They consume entire worlds. If you encounter either, she left the sentence unfinished, we'll face that if it comes. The galaxy doesn't forget settlements like yours. Something always finds them. She stood, signaling the meeting's end. Don't make me regret this, Max Vaughn. 3 days later, 217 souls slipped away like ghosts fading at dawn. They came in small groups, at different times, through different airlocks. Families that had never met, workers from different districts, all united by the desperate hope that somewhere in the vast darkness of space, they might find freedom. Max stood with Anna and Sierra at one of the embarkation points, watching other colonists board. Some looked excited, clutching their meager possessions with white-knuckled determination. Others looked terrified, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting Arbiter to appear at any moment. Their 8-year-old daughter, Sierra, pressed against Anna's side, her small hand gripping her mother's coat. She'd been told they were going on an adventure to a new world where she could run and play under open skies instead of grey corridors and recycled air. She seemed more confused than afraid. Will there be other children? Sierra asked. Yes, little star, Anna said, smoothing her daughter's hair. Lots of them. And no more press gangs. Anna's expression tightened. Even at 8, Sierra had heard the stories, understood the fear that gripped parents whenever Imperial Navy recruiters came through the districts. No more press gangs, Anna confirmed. No more tithes. No more Arbites at the door. Then why does Papa look scared? Max knelt down to meet his daughter's eyes. Because I want this to work, because I want you to grow up free, and sometimes wanting something very much can be frightening. Sierra considered this with the seriousness only children possess, then nodded. I'll be brave for you, Papa. Thank you, little star. When their turn came to board, Max took one last look at the docking ring, the tangled mess of gantries and cargo lifters, the distant glow of the hive cities beyond, the grey skies that he'd known his entire life. Somewhere down there, Petran's widow was probably working another shift, alone. Somewhere, the presses still hammered. He turned his back on it all and walked through the airlock. The warp transit took 3 months subjective time, though the navigator assured them it had been closer to 7 months real space. The distinction mattered little to those who spent the journey in the converted cargo holds, trying not to think about the unnatural currents that carried them beyond the Imperium's light. The ship groaned and shuddered constantly, its Geller fields straining against pressures that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. Max found himself praying more during those months than he ever had in the Imperium. Some of the colonists didn't make it. The warp sickness took 12 souls, nightmares so intense they stopped sleeping, stopped eating, simply faded away murmuring about things they'd seen in the shadows. Brother Erasmus administered what comfort he could, though his blessings rang hollow in the darkness between stars. The bodies were committed to the recyclers. Navigator Lauro emerged from his sealed chamber only once during the journey, summoned by Captain Severina to address the colonists' growing fear. The navigator's third eye was mercifully covered by a silk cloth, but his other 2 eyes were shot through with broken blood vessels, and his hands trembled as he gripped his staff. The warp is hungry here, he said, his voice like wind through dead leaves. The Astronomican's light is a distant flicker. We swim through currents that have tasted very little human passage. Things notice us, things follow. But we will reach Khar'vesh. I have seen the threads of fate, and they lead to your destination. At what cost? John asked. Laura's smile was terrible. There is always a cost, but it will be mine to pay, not yours. He turned to leave, then paused. A word of advice, Sergeant Krell. When you reach your new world, remember what you fled. Remember the Imperium's cruelty, yes, but also remember its purpose. Humanity needs structure, needs order, or it fractures into 1,000 warring fragments. You seek freedom. Be careful it doesn't become mere chaos. The dropship screamed through Khar'vesh's atmosphere 3 hours later, its hull scorched black from re-entry. Max gripped Anna's hand and tried to breathe through the violent shaking as they descended through clouds that sparked with purple lightning. When the landing claws finally bit into alien soil with a teeth-rattling crunch, the silence that followed felt almost sacred. "Welcome to freedom," John said, his scarred face unreadable in the emergency lighting. "Or damnation, time will tell which." The first 3 months on Khar'vesh were harder than anyone had imagined, but they were also filled with a desperate, defiant joy. The planet was classified as Death World adjacent in the fragmentary records they'd managed to acquire. A thin atmosphere that required rebreather masks for the first weeks until their bodies adapted. Dense forests of blue-black vegetation that seemed to drink the light, and gravity that was 0.95 standard, giving everyone a strange, floating sensation with each step. But it was theirs. No administratum clerks demanding census reports, no arbites enforcing curfews, no ecclesiarchy priests demanding they prostrate themselves before the emperor's image 3 times daily. No tithes, no press gangs, no munitorum requisitions that left families starving while their grain fed soldiers on distant battlefields. They had landed in a valley between 2 ridgelines, where a river of remarkably pure water cut through the alien landscape. Captain Severina had dumped their supplies with unceremonious haste. Prefab hab units, agricultural equipment, weapons, ammunition, water reclamators, a small medical facility, and enough rations to last a year if they were careful. Then the guilt venture had lifted off before anyone could change their minds, leaving them with coordinates and a grim salute. The colony took shape with surprising speed. John Krell's military experience proved invaluable. He organized work details, established a watch rotation, and oversaw the construction of a defensive perimeter. The greatest dangers seemed to be the planet itself, the occasional electrical storm that lit the sky with purple lightning, the thorned vegetation that could shred cloth and skin, and the cold that descended each night like a hammer blow. They named their settlement New Threshold, and for those first months, it felt like they had stepped across into a better life. Sierra played in grass that reached her waist, laughing as she discovered strange insects with crystalline wings. She made friends with other children, forming bonds that transcended the districts and work assignments that had separated their parents before this new life. Here, there were no hab block hierarchies, no supervisors' children and workers' children. Just children playing under an alien sun. It made the risk almost bearable. Then the disappearances began. The Harrick family lived in Hab Unit 7 near the western edge of the settlement. Davin Harrick had been a cargo hauler, his wife Myra a seamstress. They were the ones who'd lost all 3 children to Navy press gangs in a single year, a wound that had never healed. They were quiet people who kept to themselves, but they showed up for communal work details and never complained about their rations. One morning, they simply weren't there. John Krell personally led the search team to their hab unit. The door was sealed from the inside. When they overrode the lock and entered, they found the morning meal half prepared, beds unmade. No signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. Could they have wandered off? Anna suggested, though her voice carried no conviction. In the middle of the night, without taking anything. John shook his head, his hand resting on the las pistol at his hip. Something took them. They searched for 3 days. The tracking teams found nothing. No footprints leading away from the hab unit, no disturbed vegetation, no trace of the missing family. It was as if they had simply vanished into the planet's darkness. Fear began to move through New Threshold like a sickness. People stopped going out after dark. Parents kept their children within arm's reach. The watch was doubled, then tripled, with armed colonists posted at regular intervals around the perimeter. 8 days later, Gregor Saltz disappeared from his post. The watch rotation had placed him on the northern perimeter from midnight to 4 in the morning. When his relief arrived, Gregor was gone. His las rifle lay on the ground, fully charged. His rebreather mask hung from a nearby fence post. His thermos of recaf was still warm. This time, they found tracks. The prints were humanoid, but wrong. Too long. The stride length suggested something that moved in a low, loping gait. The impressions were deep despite Khar'vesh's lighter gravity, indicating significant weight. Most disturbing were the claw marks, 5 deep grooves at the end of each toe print. Xenos, John said flatly, studying the tracks with a handheld luminator. They were smart enough to avoid us until we lowered our guard, added Shane Cantor, who served as John's second-in-command. Smart enough to wait, to watch, to learn our patterns. The council meeting that night was tense. They met in the communal hall, a converted cargo container that served as the settlement's social center. The air was thick with fear and anger. "We need to send out hunting parties," John insisted. "Find these things before they take anyone else." "We don't even know what we're looking for," Anna countered. "We send people out into the forest at night. We're just giving these creatures more victims." "Then what?" "We hide in our habs and hope they go away." "We need information first," Max said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "We know almost nothing about these creatures, how many there are, where they nest, how they hunt, what their weaknesses might be. We're fighting blind." "The man's right," Shane acknowledged. "We need recon before we commit to action." They decided on a compromise. Small teams would establish observation posts on the ridgelines overlooking the valley, equipped with magnoculars and vox units. They would watch and report, but not engage unless absolutely necessary. Meanwhile, the settlement would go into full lockdown after dark. Everyone inside their habs, doors sealed, armed guards posted in reinforced positions. Brother Erasmus offered to lead the evening prayers, asking the Emperor's protection over the settlement. Some attended, others didn't. The unity they'd felt during the escape had begun to fracture under the weight of fear. Max watched the divisions form with growing concern, those who clung to faith, those who rejected it, those who simply didn't know what to believe anymore. The observation teams reported back over the following days with fragmentary information. The creatures were indeed nocturnal, emerging from the forests only after full dark. They moved in small packs, 3 to 5 individuals, coordinating their movements with disturbing intelligence. They seemed to be studying the settlement, testing the perimeter at different points, probing for weaknesses, and they were patient. "They're learning our routines," John reported at the next council meeting. His face was haggard from too many nights on watch. "They know when shifts change. They know which sections of the perimeter have the fewest guards. This isn't random hunting behavior, they're planning." "How intelligent are we talking?" Anna asked. "At least as smart as pack hunters like wolves, maybe smarter. There's something deliberate about how they move, like they're not just hunting, they're waging a campaign." Shane leaned forward, his hive ganger instincts showing through. "Then we need to take the fight to them, find their nest, their den, wherever they sleep during the day, hit them when they're vulnerable." "That requires finding them first," Max pointed out. "And we still don't know how many we're dealing with. Could be a dozen, could be hundreds." The tracking teams went out at first light, heavily armed and moving in pairs. They followed the creatures' trails back into the forests, mapping their movements, searching for concentrations that might indicate a nest or breeding ground. It took 4 days, but they found it. The cave system was nestled into the western ridgeline, about 5 kilometers from the settlement. The entrance was partially concealed by the blue-black vegetation, but the tracks leading to it were unmistakable, dozens of prints, all converging on this single point. The stench that emerged from the cave mouth was overwhelming even through rebreather masks. Decay and ammonia, and something else. Something alien that made the hindbrain scream warnings. The scout team returned to report their findings, and John immediately began planning an assault. They would hit the nest during daylight hours, when the creatures were presumably sleeping. Maximum force, overwhelming firepower, no mercy. The goal was extermination. They couldn't coexist with something that saw them as prey. But that night, before the assault could be launched, the creatures struck first. The attack came at midnight, coordinated across 3 points of the perimeter simultaneously. The guards barely had time to raise the alarm before the creatures were among them, moving with terrifying speed in the darkness. Lars' fire lit the night in stuttering flashes. Screams echoed across the compound, and chaos erupted through New Threshold like a wildfire. Max woke to the sound of gunfire and Anna's hand shaking his shoulder. "Get Sierra. Move, now." They'd planned for this. Each hab unit had a designated fallback position, a reinforced section where colonists could shelter during an attack. Max grabbed their emergency pack while Anna scooped up Sierra, who was crying in confusion and terror. They joined the stream of colonists moving toward the communal hall. Outside, the battle raged. John's trained militia was engaging the creatures at the perimeter, trying to prevent them from reaching the hab units. But the creatures were inside the wire now, skittering through the settlement with horrifying purpose. Max saw one bring down a running colonist, its claws opening the man's back. Saw another battering at a sealed door, its strength enough to dent the reinforced plasteel. A las rifle was thrust into his hands by one of the militia. "You know how to use this." "Factory security training," Max said, checking the charge pack. "It'll do. Then get to the wall. We need every gun we can get." Anna pulled Sierra into the communal hall, where Brother Erasmus was organizing the non-combatants, then turned back to join Max. "I'm coming with you." "Anna," she picked up a las rifle from a fallen militia member, her hands steady despite the chaos. "Sierra's safe. Now let's make sure she stays that way." They fought side by side on the western wall, firing in the darkness. The creatures were terrifying up close. 2 meters tall at the shoulder when they ran on all fours, with taut skin, limbs eerily human but too long. Dirty claws on the end of their phalanges, skin pale with black eyes. The battle lasted for what felt like hours. When the creatures finally retreated back into the forests, they left behind 17 dead colonists and twice that many wounded. The settlement's medical supplies, carefully rationed, were consumed in a single night, as Anna and the other medical personnel worked desperately to save who they could. They lost 4 more to their wounds before dawn. 21 dead. 1/10 of their population, gone in a single night. The funeral was held at noon, with Brother Erasmus presiding over rows of improvised graves. His voice was steady as he recited the rites, but Max saw how the priest's hands trembled when he made the sign of the Aquila. 21 souls committed to alien soil, far from the Emperor's light. "We will remember them," Erasmus said, his voice carrying across the silent assembly. "We will honor their sacrifice, and we will ensure that New Threshold survives so that their deaths have meaning." After the funeral, the council met in grim determination. There would be no more waiting, no more reconnaissance. The assault on the nest would happen tomorrow. "We end this," John said, his voice like iron. "Before they end us." The assault force numbered 43, nearly every able-bodied adult who could be spared from defending the settlement. They moved out at dawn, carrying enough ammunition to hold off an army. John led from the front, with Shane covering the rear. Max found himself in the middle of the column, las rifle gripped tight, trying not to think about what they were about to do. Anna had wanted to come, but someone needed to organize the medical response for when they returned. "Come back to me," she'd said, gripping his hands. "Come back to Sierra." "I will." "Promise me, Max," he'd promised, though they both knew such promises were hollow. You couldn't promise to survive what was coming. You could only promise to try. The trek to the cave took over an hour, moving carefully through the alien forest. The blue-black vegetation seemed to press in from all sides, and every shadow might conceal a watching creature. But they encountered no resistance. Perhaps the creatures were sleeping, or perhaps they were simply waiting. The cave mouth loomed before them like a wound in the ridge, exhaling that terrible stench. John organized the force into 3 groups, one to secure the entrance, one to push deep into the cave system, and one to hold in reserve. Luminators were distributed, checked, and rechecked. Mining charges were unpacked, 8 of them, enough to bring down the entire tunnel system if placed correctly. Final prayers were said by those who still believed in such things. Then they descended into darkness. The cave was worse than anyone had imagined. The passage sloped downward at a steep angle, the walls slick with some kind of organic secretion that made footing treacherous. The stench intensified with every step, decay and ammonia, and that alien wrongness that made stomachs churn. They found the first chamber 50 meters in. It was approximately 20 meters across, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow above. The walls glistened with the same organic coating that covered the tunnels, and scattered across the floor were the remnants of kills. Bones, both animal and disturbingly humanoid, picked clean and discarded. "Keep moving," John ordered quietly. "This is just a feeding chamber. The nest will be deeper." 3 passages branched off from the chamber, each one descending further into the earth. John chose the center tunnel. It was wider, more heavily trafficked based on the claw marks scoring the walls. They moved in tight formation, luminators cutting narrow beams through the oppressive darkness. Max's las rifle felt inadequate in his hands. The tunnel seemed to press in from all sides, the organic coating on the walls making it feel less like a cave and more like moving through the gullet of some massive beast. The first attack came without warning. A creature dropped from a crevice in the ceiling, landing on a colonist near the rear of the formation. The man's scream was cut short as claws punched through his chest. Lars' fire erupted, the confined space turning the sound into physical pain. The creature shrieked and fell, but 2 more emerged from side passages Max hadn't even noticed. "Defensive formation," John roared. "Watch the ceiling. Watch the walls." They fought in the tunnel, Lars' fire lighting the darkness in stuttering flashes. One creature lunged at Shane, who put 3 rounds through its skull at point-blank range, then had to physically push the corpse aside to keep moving. Another came at Max from the side, and he fired instinctively, the last bolt burning into its chest, barely slowing the creature until John finished it with a shot to the head. "Move. Keep moving forward." John pushed them onward, leaving the dead, both human and creature, behind in the tunnel. They descended deeper. The organic coating on the walls grew thicker, almost like a membrane. The temperature rose, the air becoming heavy and humid, harder to breathe. More creatures attacked as they pushed deeper, darting out of side passages, dropping from above, always testing, probing for weakness. The assault force learned to fire at movement, to check every shadow before advancing. They lost people. A colonist dragged screaming into a side tunnel before anyone could react. Another pulled up into a ceiling crevice, her las rifle clattering to the ground. Shane took a claw across his shoulder, deep enough to expose bone. Anna's medic training had prepared several combat medics, and one slapped a wound seal on it while they kept moving. There was no time to stop, no time to treat the wounded properly. Stop moving and they'd be overrun. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and the creatures came at them in force. The assault force formed a firing line, Lars' bolts lighting the chamber. Max fired until his las rifle's power cell warning light began to blink, dropped the depleted cell, slammed in a fresh one. Beside him, John worked with the professionalism of a guard veteran, each shot a kill. Shane fought with his knife in one hand and his las rifle in the other, roaring defiance with each strike. They drove the creatures back, dead or dying in the chamber. 2 escaped down another tunnel, trailing Ichor. "How deep does this go?" someone asked, voice shaking with exhaustion. "As deep as it needs to," John replied grimly. "We push until we find the nest." The tunnel beyond the chamber narrowed again, forcing them into single file. The organic coating was everywhere now, thick ropes of it hanging from the ceiling like obscene vines. Max had to push through it, the membrane breaking with wet tearing sounds, releasing bursts of that horrible stench. Then the tunnel opened up, and they found what they'd been looking for. The egg chamber. It was massive, and covering every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, were the eggs. Hundreds of them, their slimy membranes glinting in the glow of their luminators. Some were intact, others had already hatched, their shells cracked open and empty. "Set the charges," John said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Place them at the support points. We're bringing this whole." The sound came from the darkness beyond the eggs. A chittering, clicking sound, but deeper, resonating in a way that made Max's teeth itch. The luminators swung toward the sound, and their beams caught something that made his blood freeze. The Queen. She was easily 3 times the size of the creatures they'd been fighting, her body bloated, designed for one purpose: reproduction. Her head was similar to the smaller creatures, but larger, the jaws massive enough to bite a human in half. And she was moving toward them, her legs carrying her bulk with terrible grace. Behind her, at least a dozen more of the creatures emerged from side tunnels, surrounding the assault force. "Defensive circle," John roared. "Concentrate fire on the big one." Lars fire erupted, bolt after bolt slamming into the Queen's thick hide. She shrieked, a sound that echoed through the chamber and seemed to drive the smaller creatures into a frenzy. They came at the colonists from every direction. The assault force fought back to back, a circle of desperate violence in the center of the egg chamber. The Queen pushed through her own warriors, crushing eggs beneath her bulk in her rage. She was wounded, ichor poured from dozens of Lars burns, but she kept coming. One massive claw swept out, catching a colonist and sending him flying into the wall with bone-breaking force. "The charges," Shane yelled, fighting off 2 creatures. "We need to plant the charges." John grabbed 2 of the mining charges. "Cover me!" He broke from the circle, sprinting toward the nearest support pillar, a natural stone column that helped hold up the chamber's ceiling. The Queen saw him, turned with horrifying speed, but John was faster. He slapped the charge against the pillar, set the timer, then rolled aside as the Queen's claws tore through the space he just occupied. Max and 3 others concentrated fire on the Queen's head, forcing her to rear back, giving John time to reach the next pillar. The ex-guard sergeant moved with desperation, placing charges at structural weak points, while the assault force fought to keep the creatures off him. The Queen lunged at John as he set the 4th charge. Shane threw himself at her head, stabbing his knife into one of her eyes. She shrieked and swung her head, sending Shane crashing into the eggs. He came up bloody but already moving, drawing the Queen's attention away from John. "Last 2 charges," John yelled. He sprinted to the 5th pillar, slapped the charge, set the timer. The creatures sensed what was happening, threw themselves at the colonists with suicidal fury. The defensive circle collapsed, turned into a running fight as the assault force retreated toward the tunnel entrance. John reached the 6th and final support point, right at the chamber's entrance. He set the charge, twisted the timer, then looked up to see the Queen bearing down on him, her massive bulk shaking the ground. "John!" Max screamed. The sergeant fired his las rifle one-handed while setting the final timer with the other. The Queen's claw swept down. John threw himself backward, the claw missing him by centimeters. "Move, everyone out," they ran. Behind them, the Queen's shriek of rage echoed through the tunnels. Max's legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he ran anyway. Ran past the chambers they'd fought through, ran through tunnels slick with organic matter, ran toward the distant light of the cave entrance. The first charge detonated. The tunnel shook, dust and fragments raining down from the ceiling. Then the second charge, the third. A chain reaction as the support pillars failed and thousands of tons of rock began to shift, to fall, to collapse. Max saw daylight ahead, saw the cave mouth. He ran with all the energy he had left, throwing himself through the opening just as the 4th charge detonated. Behind them, the cave entrance imploded, collapsing inward with a grinding roar that seemed to go on forever. Dust and debris exploded outward, and then silence. Max lay on the ground, gasping for air, his ears ringing. Around him, the survivors did the same. They'd made it out. Barely. John did a quick head count. They'd lost nearly half the assault force in the tunnels, but the survivors had made it, and the nest was destroyed, buried under tons of collapsed rock. "Is it over?" someone asked. John stared at the collapsed cave entrance, watching for any sign of movement. They waited, weapons ready, watching for any creature that might have made it out, but nothing came. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the settling of rock deep underground. After an hour, John called for them to move out. The survivors sat in exhausted silence, too drained for celebration. They won, the nest was destroyed, the threat eliminated, but the cost had been staggering. Max found himself sitting next to Shane, both of them staring at the smoke rising from the collapsed cave. We killed them all, Shane said quietly. Every last one. Max had no response to that. They sat in silence until John called for them to move out, to return to New Threshold and begin the long process of healing. No victory celebration waited for them, only the grim work of counting the dead and tending the wounded. Anna met Max at the perimeter, pulling him into a fierce embrace that spoke of fear and relief in equal measure. Never again, she whispered into his shoulder. He couldn't promise that, but he held her tight anyways. The settlement went into mourning. Brother Erasmus presided over the funerals, his voice steady, but his face showing every year of his age. Afterwards, he requested a private meeting with the council. They gathered in the communal hall as evening fell, exhausted and emotionally drained. The priest stood before them, his hands folded, his expression sorrowful. "We've become good at killing," Erasmus said quietly. "Efficient, organized, ruthless." "We did what we had to do," John replied, his voice defensive. The council sat in uncomfortable silence. It was Shane who finally spoke. "So what are you saying? That we should have let them kill us?" "No, I'm saying we should be honest about what we are. We're not noble rebels fighting tyranny. We're survivors who killed to stay alive and will kill again if necessary. That's neither good nor evil. It simply is." Erasmus looked around the room, his gaze touching each of them. "But be careful that in fighting monsters, we don't become them. That freedom doesn't become just another word for doing what we want without accountability." He stood slowly, as if bearing a great burden. "And perhaps have room for doubt, for questioning, for admitting that survival sometimes requires terrible things, but those terrible things still carry a cost." After the priest left, the council sat in silence for a long time. Finally, John spoke. "He's not wrong, but he's also not entirely right. The Imperium would have never hesitated. They would have burned the nest and congratulated themselves on their righteousness. At least we're asking the question." "Is that enough?" Anna asked. "It has to be," Max said, "because it's all we have." The weeks that followed were focused on rebuilding and healing. The wounded recovered slowly under Anna's care. The defenses were strengthened, expanded, made more robust. Watch rotations were refined based on hard-learned lessons. And gradually, cautiously, life began to return to normal. There were no more attacks from the creatures. Occasionally, scouts would find tracks in the forest, evidence that some had survived and were watching from a distance, but they never approached the settlement again. Perhaps they had learned that humans were too dangerous to hunt. Perhaps they were simply rebuilding their numbers elsewhere. Or perhaps, as Anna theorized, the destruction of the nest had broken some kind of territorial hold. Whatever the reason, New Threshold had breathing room and had survived. They had paid for that survival in blood and nightmares. They were survivors who'd killed to stay alive and would kill again if necessary. But they were also free. Genuinely, terrifyingly free. Free to make their own choices and live with their own consequences. Free to build something or destroy themselves trying. Free to prove the Imperium wrong or to demonstrate exactly why humanity needed its iron grip. Time would tell which. Max walked with Anna toward the communal hall, where breakfast awaited, and their daughter was already chattering about the day's lessons. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the valley in all its strange beauty. There were mysteries here, dangers they didn't yet understand. The creatures they'd fought were just one threat among many, but they would face those threats as they came, together, free, on their own terms.